네, 목화악기 TV 시청자 여러분 안녕하십니까? 목화악기 서울인사동지점 지점장 정민태입니다. 오늘 굉장히 특별한 제품 고객님들께 소개시켜 드리려고 합니다. 우리가 보통 색소폰을 연주를 이제 하신다고 하시면은 필수적으로 가지고 계셔야 될 제품들이 여러 개가 있는데요. 색소폰인 건 당연하고 마우스피스, 리드, 케이스, 이렇게 리가처 다 있어야겠죠. 하지만 우리가 응급상황 발생 시에나 급하게 자가수리 해야 될 타이밍이나 이럴 때 가장 색소폰 같은 경우는 드라이버 같은 경우가 일반적인 공구들과는 하나도 맞지 않아서 그런 난처한 경험을 겪으신 연주자분들이나 전공하시는 분들도 많이 있으실 거고, 아마추어 분들도 그런 경험이 있으신 경우도 있으실 거예요. 그래서 지금 요 앞에 보이시는 요 파우치 안에는 미국 보스턴사, 요새 가장 핫한 보스턴 마우스피스와 보스턴 리가처 제조하는 보스턴사에서 제작하는 제품인데요. 단순히 설명드리면은 멀티툴입니다. 멀티툴인데 색소폰 하시는 분들이라면은 필수로 꼭 하나쯤은 가지고 계셔야 될 그런 제품이에요. 보시면은 튼튼하고 아주 고급스러운 소재의 제품으로 만들어져 있는데요. 로고도 이렇게 찍혀 있습니다. 멀티툴이기 때문에 우리가 시중에 많이 알고 계시고 많이 사용하시는 그런 맥가이버 칼, 스위스 아미 나이프 있죠? 그런 개념으로 지금 되어 있는데, 색소폰을 취미로 하시는 분들이나 연주하시는 분들에게 가장 필수로 필요한 제품이라고 보시면 됩니다. 기본적으로 우리가 색소폰을 하시다 보면 응급으로 조치를 해야 될 부분들이 여러 가지 상황이 있죠. 예를 들어서 밸런스 문제라던가 로드의 나사가 풀려가지고 키가 덜그락거린다던가, 아니면은 키에 스프링이 빠져서 그걸 다시 채워야 되시는 경우가 있는데, 그런 거에 딱 맞게 악기 케이스나 가방에, 주머니에 넣고 다니실 수 있는 그런 크기로 제작된 제품입니다. 그래서 여기 보시면은 기본적으로 맨 오른쪽 부품부터, 공구부터 꺼내서 보여드리면은 드라이버 날이 있죠. 가장 작은 드라이버 날이 있고요. 중간 사이즈 날이 또 들어 있습니다. 마지막에 가장 큰 날이 이렇게 들어가 있어서 드라이버 날이 지금 3개가 들어가 있습니다. 가장 작은 거, 중간, 큰 거 이렇게 들어 있는데, 가장 작은 날 같은 경우는 이런 네 개 있는 요 볼트를 풀고 조일 수 있는 딱 크기입니다. 가장 작은 사이즈의 날이 들어가야 되는 부분엔 다 들어갑니다. 여기도 보시면은 이렇게 지금 들어가죠. 이렇게 하실 수가 있고, 중간 사이즈의 날 같은 경우도 중간 사이즈의 날이 필요한 곳에 이렇게 꺼내서 사용하시면 딱 맞고요. 이 큰 날 같은 경우는 이런 색소폰 로드에 이런 피버 스크류 같은 거 사용하시는 건데, 우리나라 시장에 셀마 빈티지 악기 같은 거 굉장히 많으시죠? 빈티지 악기 같은 경우는 정말 이렇게 조여놔도 금방 풀리는 경우도 있고요. 피버 스크류가 빠져가지고 이 키에 유격이 발생한다 하면은 이렇게 보스턴 섹스샵의 이 멀티 툴을, 이 공구를 이렇게 사용하셔서 이렇게 돌려서 이렇게 딱 쪼시면은 문제 해결이 될 수가 있죠. 기본적으로 이 날들도 굉장히 튼튼하고, 이 손으로 잡았을 때 이 그랩이라 그래야 될까요? 요게 딱 알맞게 돼 있어 가지고, 그리고 날들이 이런 식으로 다 완벽히 펴지기도 하지만 요렇게도 사용이 가능하셔서, 드라이버를 좀 이렇게 일직선으로 드라이버를 세우지 못하시는 공간에도 요런 식으로 딱 드라이버 날을 딱 집어넣으실 수가 있죠. 키가드의 볼트도 굉장히 자주 풀리는데 요런 것도 이렇게 조여주실 수가 있습니다. 전문 수리사 분들이 출장 가실 때 이거 하나만 있으면 또 굉장히 공간도 줄고 무게도 줄지 않습니까? 그렇게 사용하실 수가 있고, 전용 드라이버 날 제외하고 또 하나를 소개시켜 드리면, 요런 게 이렇게 들어가 있습니다. 요런 게 아시는 분들은 아시겠지만 이 스프링 훅입니다. 스프링이 우리가 빠지시는 경우도 굉장히 종종 많죠. 손님들을 보면 저음키가 그냥 완전히 빠져서 그냥 계속 불고 다니시는 분들도 있는데, 우리 색소폰 훅을 가지고 이렇게 빼고 다시 넣고, 그리고 스프링 훅을 빼신 상태에서 스프링 강도도 이렇게 조절을 하실 수가 있어요. 여기 보시면은 이렇게 스프링이 딱 들어가는 공간이 있어서 이렇게 누르셔가지고 강도를 조절을 하실 수도 있고, 훅을 이용해서 당겨서 또 강도를 조절하실 수도 있죠. 반대편에 보시면은 우리가 보통 공연 중에 그 리드를 갑자기 교체하게 되는 상황에 리드가 새 거이거나 리드가 너무 빡빡한 경우에, 아니면은 잘 안 불리는 느낌을 받으실 때는 리드 다듬는 기구를 통해서 이런 리드의 테이블 표면을 이렇게 조금 연마를 해주셔가지고 평탄화 작업을 좀 한다고 하면은 소리의 반응성이 굉장히 확 살아나죠. 그리고 리드가 조금 너무 두껍거나 밸런스가 안 맞으실 때 좌우 밸런스를 맞추실 수도 있고, 리드의 강도를 조금 약하게 만드실 수가 있는 게 리드 다듬는 툴인데, 요새 굉장히 미국에서 핫한 제품도 있고 국내에서는 미국에서 전 세계적으로 핫한 리드기라는 상품을 보고 좀 변형 아니면 많이 따라해서 지금 나오는 제품들이 있는데, 리드 다듬는 기구가 이 보스턴 멀티툴 전용 공구에 이렇게 들어 있습니다. 그래서 이건 어떻게 사용하시냐면은, 여기 보시면은 자세히 보시면은 정사각형의 이런 금속이 있는데, 자세히 만져보시면 날이 조금 더 살아있는 경우가 있고 날이 안 살아있는 경우도 있어요. 그래서 우리가 리드가 굉장히 빡빡하고 잘 안 불릴 때 반응성을 향상시키고자 리드 테이블 표면을 가공을 하시잖아요. 그럴 때 여기 있는 칼날이 있는 부분을 이런 식으로 리드 표면을, 리드 테이블 부분을 이렇게 다듬는 겁니다. 요거는 깎는 개념이 아니고요. 리드가 여기에 평탄화가 잘 되어 있는 상태에서 마우스피스 테이블에 이렇게 딱 붙어서 압착이 딱 잘 돼야지 반응성이 굉장히 살아나고 불기가 좋아지는데, 그런 작업을 하는 거라고 보시면 됩니다. 그래서 여기 칼날이 있는 부분을 이런 식으로 아주 부드럽게 그냥 살짝 이렇게 스쳐 지나가시면은 이렇게 보시면은 갈려나온 게 보이시죠? 그 이후에 여기를 만져보시면 정말 부드럽게 완만하게 좌우 밸런스를 다듬으실 때는 이런 식으로, 여기보다 여기가 좀 두껍다 그러면은 여기 왼쪽에 사이드 레일 부분을 요 칼날로 이렇게 다 가다듬어 주시는 거예요. 그리고 너무 뻑뻑하다 해가지고 이런 팁부분을 살짝 날리면은 굉장히 빡빡한 게 좀 덜해지고 조금 더 쉽게 분리시는 그런 경험을 해주실 수가 있어요. 이런 식으로 리드를 가다듬는 제품이 보스턴 전용 색소폰 전용 공구 멀티툴에 들어있다 보니까 이런 거 하나쯤 구비해 두시면은 굉장히 좋으실 거예요. 이렇게 다시 딱 닫으면 되죠. 이렇게 키링 같은 데다 이렇게 걸어서 다니실 수 있게 여기 고리도 지금 링이 있고요. 이렇게 뭐 달고 다니시면은, 아니면 주머니에 쏙 넣고 다니시거나, 뭐 케이스 안에 뭐 마우스피스 파우치에 같이 보관하신다거나 하면은 아주 위급 상황에 아주 톡톡히 역할을 할 수 있는 제품이 이 보스턴 전용 색소폰 전용 공구, 보스턴사에서 나오는 이 멀티툴인데요. 방금 계속 앞서 보여드린 대로 웬만한 응급 상황에는 다 대응하실 수가 있습니다. 리드를 만약에 교체해야 될 시에 리드의 컨디션을 조절할 수 있는 거, 스프링이 빠졌을 때 스프링을 끼워 넣거나 다시 제자리에 장착을 하실 수 있는 거, 그리고 로드들이나 밸런스 볼트들이 풀려서 좀 악기 밸런스가 흐트러지거나 피벗 스크류 같은 게 빠져서 키가 지금 달그락거린다, 그럴 때 사용하실 수 있는 전용 드라이버 날, 대중소로 색소폰의 모든 부분에 사용하실 수 있는 전용 날이 이렇게 들어있는 보스턴 멀티툴이었습니다.
Hey, this is Jack Tyler from the Boston Sax Shop, and in this video we're going to be going over how to use the Voyager saxophone multi-tool. Let's go ahead and jump in and see what we can do with the Voyager. So first and foremost, we have 3 precision screwdriver blades that are on the multi-tool that are going to allow you to make precise adjustments to the different areas of the horn. I'm talking to you out there if you've got a bunch of like random eyeglass screwdrivers kicking around in your case. That's not going to cut it. It's really important to have the correct size blade when you're working on any part of the horn, because without it, not only can you easily slip out of the screw slots and do damage to the horn, but you can damage the screws themselves. So it's important to know what to use where. So up front we have a 4mm screwdriver blade. This is going to be great for pivot screws and adjustment screws. A 3mm blade, this is going to be for your stack keys like the left hand stack, the right hand stack, and depending on your horn, for the low E flat and C keys and the side of sharp. And then we have our 2mm blade, which is going to be perfect for the octave key on the neck, the palm keys, and the smaller rods on the side C and side B flat. So first off, one of the most common issues with a saxophone that all of a sudden was playing great and all of a sudden is not, is that the low notes just become stuffy and muddy and resistant. Typically, the problem here is that the G-sharp adjustment screw has gone out of regulation. If we look at the G-sharp on most saxophones, it's being articulated by the low notes, low B, C sharp, and B flat, meaning when you play those notes, it's actively lifting up that G-sharp key. The only thing that is keeping the G-sharp closed, and therefore keeping a massive leak in the middle of the horn happening, is the adjustment screw that sits above it that is typically attached to the F-sharp key in the right hand. This material underneath can easily get compressed due to changes in humidity, to your saliva getting on it. There are a myriad of different ways that this thing can go wrong. But if it compresses and the G-sharp is venting when you play those lower notes, the entire horn is going to play really, really poorly on the lower end. So if you find yourself in a situation where all of a sudden the low notes become very difficult to get out, we're going to first start by doing what I like to call the low C test. So this test involves playing a low C, and once you play the note, and you've articulated it, you take your left pinky and you articulate the G-sharp touch piece. When you do this, after you've hit the note, if you hear the note start to crack or break up or just, go away entirely, this is a really good indication that the G-sharp is venting. So to make the adjustment to fix this issue, you're first going to locate the G-sharp adjustment screw. Then you're going to take the largest blade, the 4mm blade on your Voyager, insert it into the screw head and turn about 1/8 to 1/4 turn, and then repeat the low C test until you can play that note, open the G-sharp key, and not feel anything change. This should inherently fix the problem with the lower notes after that. Now, if you happen to go too far, you're going to know right away, because the right hand is going to become incredibly hard to play, because you'll actually be holding open the F-sharp key if you screw down too far. It's very easy to fix this. Just go back the other direction until you find the balance, again using the low C test as your reference. There are also a few other adjustments that can be made in a similar fashion. One is the bis B flat adjustment screw, which is located right next to the G sharp. So the bis key, of course, is a way to be able to play a B flat using either 1-in-1, 2-in-1, or 3-in-1 in terms of our fingerings of the right hand, and is adjusted in a very similar way again to the G sharp. You have an adjustment screw that can be turned clockwise to create more pressure on the armature connected to the bis B flat key in order to create a seal. So again, if you're having problems with your bis speaking, if you're using a 1-in-1 fingering, this is an easy adjustment that can be made using the 4mm screwdriver blade on your Voyager. Now, on many modern saxophones, there's also a very similar adjustment screw connecting the low B and the low C sharp key. Now, on this vintage saxophone, I don't have one, unfortunately, but what this does is allows for pressure from the low B key to keep the low C sharp key sealed when you roll your pinky from B to B flat, so that there's no venting if you happen to accidentally bump the low C sharp when you're playing between those two notes. So to test to see if this regulation is intact and in fact working, simply play a low B and then move your pinky in a position where you're pressing down the C sharp as well. If that B immediately cracks and disappears, you'll know that you need to tighten up that regulation. And again, moving about 1/4 turn, even 1/8 of a turn at a time clockwise to add more pressure to that adjustment screw down on the low C sharp armature will allow you to make that regulation concisely. Another really common problem that can happen is a rod or even pivot screw backing out of its inherent resting position due to sympathetic vibration. This is especially true with vintage horns. I think you all know what I'm talking about. Everything is playing great, all of a sudden it's not, and you happen to notice that one of the rods or screws in your saxophone is sticking about a ½ inch out of the horn. When this happens, it can throw off the alignment of the keys. And again, not having the proper screwdriver at hand is going to make it very difficult, trying to use your thumbnail or something like that to reinsert and tighten that rod to prevent it from happening again. So if you find yourself in that situation where there's that pesky rod that continually backs out, you can use your Voyager multi-tool using, again, the 4mm blade for pivot screws, 3mm for your hinge rods, and the 2mm for the smaller hinge rods like the palm keys and the side keys to be able to accurately tighten the horn back up. There is nothing more disheartening than opening up your case, starting to play, and realizing that one of the keys in the stacks is moving incredibly sluggishly, not even coming back up to its original position sometimes. The root cause of this is usually one of two things. Either there is oxidation that is forming between the steel hinge rod and the brass hinge tube that is causing a rub or a bind, or there's been a little bit of a bump that may have damaged the rod and made it untrue, which again is rubbing against the inside of the hollow hinge tubes of your saxophone keys. Though it doesn't work every single time, more likely than not, if you actually back out the rod a quarter turn at a time, testing for a key that is binding, you can find that sweet spot which will allow the key to move again. Either you'll be breaking up the rust just enough to get the key working, or you'll find the correct orientation of the rod in order to allow the key to move freely again. Now, again, this is not a final solution for a problem like this. It's a mechanical situation that either needs to be addressed by creating a new rod, straightening a rod, or removing that rust, and you should schedule an appointment with a local technician at your earliest convenience. The springs on your saxophone are what controls the action of your keys, and are usually not something you have to concern yourself with as a saxophone player until one of them happens to get caught on your clothing or in the case and pops out of its cradle. This can be so annoying to try to get these things back in if you don't have the proper tool, which of course is included on the Voyager. This is a spring hook, and what this will allow you to do is easily manipulate the springs, both putting them in and out of the cradle. Whenever we're doing anything with a spring, we always want to make sure to put the tool in the correct position. If you look at the spring on a saxophone, it has a pointed tip which goes to a straight shank. The correct placement of the tool on the spring to ensure that we're not going to have any surprises is right below where the angle of the tip meets the shank. Putting the spring hook either at the very end of the spring or towards where it's actually installed in the post could run the risk of breaking it, and we never want to be in that situation. In fact, I would strongly recommend, if you can, if you're adjusting the springs on your saxophone, to be wearing some kind of eye protection just in case something goes wrong. As a secondary safety note, if you notice that there is a lot of rust that has built up on your spring, or it looks like it's about to break, don't mess with it, even if it's the only thing keeping your horn from playing. Now, there are going to be some occasions where you might actually need to remove a key from the saxophone, either to clean it, to have a closer inspection with what's actually going on, or to access other parts of the instrument. The first step before you remove any key from the saxophone is to disengage the spring. You don't want the key to come flying off as soon as you undo either its pivot screws or hinge rod. Now, if you're taking off a key that has pivot screws, it's pretty simple. Again, disengage the spring, then back out one of the pivot screws until it comes out. You should be able to remove it with your hand and then carefully remove the key in order to access another one, or again, have a closer inspection of that key or pad. Now, in the instance of a hinge rod, like something in the left-hand stack or one of our side keys, you want to back that screw out after you've disengaged any springs involved until you hear a click. Once you hear that click, that means that the threads have passed through the post at the very end of the stack and it's safe to start pulling on it. If you can't get the rod out with your hands, it's probably a sign that it needs to go to a technician because there could be rust involved. And if you need to use a pair of pliers to remove the rod, make sure you're always holding those pliers perpendicular to the screw slot as not to close it down, and also using pliers that have either a flat or round jaw with absolutely no serration or sharp edges so that you don't end up damaging the rod. Now, in addition to being able to put a spring back in its cradle on the saxophone, you can also, if you're feeling a little bit more advanced, adjust the action on your horn using the spring hook on the Voyager. Whenever we're adjusting the action on a spring, the first thing that you're going to do is remove it from the cradle and note its natural inclination both in terms of its angle and curvature. In order to increase the tension on a spring, if you want to add stiffer action or try to add strength to a key that might be blowing open, you want to pull that spring or push that spring in the direction it's already headed and then carefully put it back into place in its cradle. And anytime you're reinstalling a spring, you never want to go any further than you have to in order to get it in position so you don't change the action. If you want to do the opposite and lighten the action of a spring, you want to again either pull or push it in the opposite direction that it is naturally moving once it's out of the cradle. This will give the action a lighter feel. Last but certainly not least, we have a reed leveling tool. Whenever you're traveling, you're dealing with different climates, different humidities, and this can wreak absolute havoc on your reed's performance and longevity. One of the most common issues that happens with reeds is that they warp. And I'm not just talking about the tip of the reed warping, which I'm sure all of you are very familiar with, but actually the table of the reed warping. This is the thickest part of the reed blank, and as a result, it's going to absorb the most amount of moisture as it's being used. Over time, typically there will form a bump in this area that can actually push it off the table of your mouthpiece, creating a reed that plays really stuffy and inconsistent. Using our reed leveling tool, we can very easily correct this problem by quickly making a few passes moving away from you using the flat part so that it resurfaces the reed. Doing this every so often, even if you don't think there is a problem, is going to definitely increase the life of your reeds and more importantly, their performance and response. I hope you've enjoyed this video overview of the Voyager multi-tool. Should you have any questions or concerns, feel free, of course, to contact us at bostonsaxshop.com.